Hey, do you teach yoga? Have you ever trained to lead yoga classes, to be a yoga therapist? Have you ever owned a yoga studio? Maybe even just wondered what it was like for the women and men up there in front of the room on their mats, leading you through endless Surya Namaskars, down dogs, and pranayamas galore? Well, these are their stories, and mine. I'm Rebecca Sebastian, a 20-year yoga teacher, 10-year yoga therapist, yoga studio owner, and co-founder of a yoga-focused nonprofit. I've done a lot in the yoga world over the last 20 years. Pretty much everything except had a water cooler. You know, a place to share stories, talk about struggles, successes, and find other people who do the same thing that I do. Welcome to Working in Yoga, a podcast and substitute water cooler for yoga folks to connect and build community, to share our unique profession, our challenges, and our journeys with the world.
Hey friends, welcome to Working in Yoga. Today on the podcast, I'm pushing the discussion about online learning forward with my friend Zaria Rochester. Now, Zaria and I know each other in real life, as you will quickly hear, and she has spent years learning yoga both online and offline. So I asked, is there a difference? Do you find that one kind of yoga training is better or more impactful than another? This is something I think about a lot, especially since 2020, where we all shifted into online teaching for a time. What makes a skillful online teacher? Is there learning happening in the room, even when it's virtual? If you head back to our second ever episode with my friend and Iyengar yoga studio owner, Steph Tenser, she talked about the clear impact that online learning was having on her students. And I think her message still stands. Online learning can be powerful, and it makes us more accessible. But what about synchronous versus asynchronous learning? Are the videos on demand that you get from those $99 Become a Yoga Teacher courses that we see advertised online the same as having a synchronous learning experience where we can interact with our teachers? Zaria and I talk about that too. So stay tuned and take a listen. In the meantime, follow or subscribe to the podcast if you would, please. You know why. It helps to tell other people who are also yoga pros that this podcast is out there. That brings more of us together, which is something that I really love. And as always, thank you to our sponsor, Sunlight Streams. Sunlight runs an online self-care blog, and until the end of the year, we are talking about how to care for yourself at your workplace. That's an especially difficult conversation when your job is wellness, like ours is. So we will get into that too. Grab the latest blog at www.thesunlightexperience.com/blog. Now, take a listen to my podcast with Zaria Rochester. Hey friends, welcome to Working in Yoga. Okay, so this week is going to be a very interesting conversation, I think, for you all to listen to, because my friend Zaria Rochester is on the podcast this week, and she and I know each other in person, like we've had coffee so many times and talked about so many things in the yoga universe. So Zaria's on the podcast this week to talk about online learning, because this is something we've been conversing about off and on this podcast for a while. So Zaria, tell everybody who you are, and hi, it's nice to see you.
Hello, thanks so much for having me. I'm Zaria Rochester. My pronouns are they and she. I am a yoga teacher. I am currently in training to be a yoga therapist, and I study Ayurveda and Vedic astrology as well. And I'm also a reentry services coordinator at a nonprofit in Iowa City, Iowa, where I am, that supports folks that are returning from incarceration coming to Johnson County. So a lot of the nexus between community organizing work and yoga is kind of where I live. And it's really fun to be here with you because, as Rebecca said, we know each other quite well, and we could talk about this stuff for as long as Zoom is in existence.
That's terrible. I got another podcast to record later today, so we're going to have to hold it down for it can't be 3 hours. Okay, but I also let's slide first into online learning. Can you tell me a little bit how you trained throughout your career as a yoga professional and where you trained? Some on person, some online. Can we start there?
Yeah, so mine has been quite a mixed bag of both. I did my first 200-hour teacher training in 2017, 2018, and that was fully in person here in Iowa City. And then there's been some supplemental workshops that I've done, some training with teachers at conferences that I've gone to that have been in person, but the rest of my actual programs of learning that I've been through with yoga and Ayurveda and Vedic astrology, or yoga therapy, I mean to say, have been virtual. So a lot of my training, the brunt of my training has been online.
So I first and foremost want your opinion about this because a lot of us who spent like 10, 15, 20 years in the industry, we all trained in person because there were no virtual options. And now we're like really crappy about virtual training. Like we all love to get on our podcasts and on our high horses about how there's got to be student to teacher transmission and it all has to be a particular way. And as you and I have had this discussion before, like I feel like that makes new teachers who are coming up in the industry who may have trained online feel crappy. And also, I don't know that that's true. I don't know that I believe that transmission of teacher and student must be in person. What are your thoughts?
So I really love that you mentioned the feeling crappy part because I'm going to start there
Yeah,
because
please do.
yeah, because there is that idea like coming up in yoga world after 2015. There was this idea that what it was supposed to look like this traveling to this place and doing the whole experience where you have the immersion. If you didn't do that and didn't have that model to follow, that there was something missing. So, and because like also like pre 2020 and pre COVID era, even like academic learning online was kind of like, scoffed at, seen as like not legit. And that I think was really relevant and present in training in general too. It just didn't seem like it was as real as legitimate. But as I went forward and continued going on, that really went away, the feeling bad, because I could see that my skills were getting better. I could see that I was training online and um wasn't actually falling behind, was still meeting people, was still like cultivating a practice and like continuing to grow in that way. And the biggest thing was that I wouldn't have been able to do anything that I'm doing right now without the opportunity to train online. So I never had the capacity to spend money on travel and then take time off of work and then to be away. So the fact that I was able to be here in Iowa City, but still train someplace out of Colorado, train from someplace out of Florida, train from someplace out of California, that was then able to let me not only stay here and do the work where I live as I was learning, but was still able to have really good training processes. So I kind of, before hopping on here, was thinking about that journey too, about like when I shifted over from feeling deficient from being in like from doing a lot of online training and feeling like that was bad versus being like, no, this is still really legitimate and really rigorous training. I'm still showing up and sitting in front of a screen and my attention is there for a period of time. And I really want to touch on the transference part that we talk about in yoga, because we can. It still comes through
Yeah.
Zoom. It still comes through Zoom. And I've had the experiences of being in person with a teacher and sitting down with my awareness that the next weekend I was going to be on a Zoom call in a training. And if I'm sitting here watching the person, I'm still looking in the person's eyes on the screen, it's still coming through the same way. So I think it's a bit silly that if you really get into yoga and working with the subtle body and prana, that we can pull prana and energy from all of these sources, but it wouldn't work through training on Zoom. I think that gap doesn't make a lot of sense to me, and my experience hasn't shown that it doesn't work either. So, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking of like, so you and I have been in person. I'm thinking about this yoga conference we were both at last year where there was a teacher there, like a big name teacher who was there who had 50 people in the room. I mean, you can't tell me that's any more personal if you're one of 50 people in a room versus one of 50 people on Zoom. It's still 50 people. It's still not a one-on-one experience. So I'm like, I'm curious how like Like, what is more personal for most people's thoughts of like, oh, if I'm one of 50 in a room, it's different. Is it? I mean, I don't know if it is.
Yeah, I think it's interesting too in terms of the difference between, I do think that they are different experiences though. So like in a room group setting, I feel like there is something that you can feel into more of the energy of the group that kind of feels more of like a cohesion. But I feel like a lot of facilitators these days too encourage people to feel into all of the other people that are present with them in a Zoom space. But what's different about the Zoom space is that you are very much in your own energy, which for me has been helpful in some ways because I've been able to really feel into like, okay, what do I think about what I'm learning right now? There's not
Yeah.
the pressure to behave in a certain way. There's no of the, like there's no none of those group dynamics to potentially tend to, which can also be really present in like a spiritual space or a practice space with yoga where you feel like you are supposed to be receiving the teachings or reacting to the teachings in a certain way instead of just allowing yourself to have the experience. Whereas I'm in my office at my house on Zoom, I can just allow myself to have the experience
Yeah.
and be still in my own energy as I'm absorbing that, and as I'm learning, as I'm processing what I'm learning. So I think there are different experiences that both have uh, a lot to offer in different ways.
Yeah, I agree. It doesn't mean that because they're different, it doesn't mean that one is better or worse than the other. They're just different experiences. And I also feel like, and I'd be curious to hear your thoughts about this, but I feel like, especially those of us who are teaching, who are from my generation of teachers, those 15, 20 years in, it's a skill set we don't yet have. It makes us uncomfortable. It forces us to sit with our discomfort. And instead of saying, I'm uncomfortable because learning new things is uncomfortable, we just say it's bad. Thoughts?
Odds, for sure. So I did my teacher training, right? My first one. And then I went off and was a summer camp counselor at a summer camp and then came back and really like took my deep breath in, was about to really start teaching yoga. And then COVID literally happened within the same 2 weeks that was about to happen. So I got like a few classes under my belt before I started teaching online, but then I was immediately teaching to just the green light. I wasn't even doing Zoom meetings. It was like webinars. So then I had to start teaching in a room by myself to the green light, watching
Yeah.
myself. And it made me work through all of my discomfort of A, being seen
Yes.
on camera, seeing my body in the practice,
Yes.
because I hadn't had a practice of looking at myself in a mirror a whole lot before then, listening to the recording and then hearing my voice, having to deal with
Yeah.
the how I sound. I had to really, so that looking, I hated that. I felt so awful when that was happening. Like, this is not the yoga experience I'm supposed to be having. Like, I'm supposed to be, on the stage. There's supposed to be all the people there. What is it? Where are the festivals at? Like, what is happening? Like, so all of the ideas, all of the fantasies were like just crumbling down as I was just like in my living room teaching, and it felt very not glamorous. And
Yeah, it's not.
it was not the fantasy that I had that I was thought was going to be unfolding. And so, but I see that period of time now and see all that discomfort that I was going through as absolutely correct. Like, I'm really glad that I went through all of that discomfort because now I'm able to be on a video and see myself and hear myself and kind of look for what I'm actually conveying when I'm teaching, and like being able to actually go back and listen to myself teach a class. I wasn't even able to do that back
Yeah.
back in the day. Like, I hated it so much. I was like, no, I can't do this. It was too vulnerable. I couldn't be there with myself in that way yet. So
Oh,
having to work through all of that, brought me to a completely different place. And I now have such appreciation for that because what it made me do is I had to trust in what I was teaching. I had to trust what was coming through because there was not anybody in the room responding to what I was doing. I was getting no feedback. And so it
yeah.
was like really crushing for a while at the beginning because it was like the people telling you thank you, that sweet moment like after class where like at our studio, we top everybody's tea off a little
Yeah.
bit where there's still some silence. I didn't get any of that. The screen shut off and I was there and my heart just went boom, and I think that at that time there was also a lot more collective grieving and isolation that was
Yes.
happening for sure.
Yeah.
But on a personal level, I had to really trust in what I was teaching without any feedback. So I had, which was absolutely something I needed to do and cultivate, was learning how to actually trust myself and trust my own voice. Um, so I was made to do that. So I hated that green light 4 years ago, but right now I don't hate that green light as much.
Yeah, I mean, you've said it exactly right. I mean, there is that point at the beginning where, oh my gosh, when I was recording those videos like March 2020, April 2020, when we were all online and that was where we had to go. Oh, I just put them out there. I was like, whatever it looks like, I couldn't watch it either. Like I couldn't. It was so uncomfortable. But again, just because, see, in my opinion, we have a full industry of people who have a lot of trauma, and folks who have experienced trauma are very good at reading a room. It's the skill that we all had from our childhoods that kept us safe. Thank you, body, for keeping me safe. Thank you, brain and nervous system, for keeping me safe. And now we have these jobs as adults that utilize that particular skill to read a room to help folks transform their lives. But we've taken away this essential part of what we consider our job, which is how we can read a room and move what we're doing based on what's in the room, because we're not in the room with people anymore. It doesn't mean that what we're doing is worse or not good enough or just, a band-aid. It just means that we have to use different skills. You have to learn. It's
Yeah.
okay.
In the same way that that spaces like ours that have moved away from hands-on adjustment as well,
Yeah.
it made us get more skilled at cueing. It made us get more
Yes.
skilled with our language that we're using. How can we be more precise? What I'm saying obviously isn't being picked up by the room. What do I need to do to change? Instead of just going up and physically shifting somebody's body instead, like
Yes.
I have to work a little bit harder and become a little bit more skillful. And going back to the transmission piece, I think that we're not, so if we're in a room, maybe we're responding if we can see people's squares, but even a lot of times you'll be in a training too, and most people don't, it doesn't feel right to be practicing with the camera on, so they'll turn the
Yeah.
camera off. So
Yeah.
sometimes you are still just broadcasting to names on blank, Zoom screens.
Yes.
And so from that place too, it's kind of a question of, well, if I'm not able to react in real time to what's happening with the folks in the room, that again just kind of makes us have to be more like in touch and grounded in ourselves to then just trust what is coming through or what we had prepared for class.
Ooh,
Um,
there's that word.
and then
Yes.
what we prepared.
Prepared.
Yes, what we
Prepared.
had prepared. So the ability of being in the room is, yes, we can shift on a dime to meet
Yes.
the needs of what's happening in the space. If we're just broadcasting to a bunch of people, perhaps there's, some people have like 200 people on their Zoom classes these days.
Yes.
Like that's wild. And that they're just broadcasting to a whole huge group of people, so that from that point in time, they just have to be grounded in what they're going to say, because no matter what they're saying, it's not going to meet 200 people exactly the way that they want it to, but it might meet 150 of them, and the other 50 will maybe realize something that they didn't like from it. And so even from that point, there's just the trust in what we prepared and teaching from what's coming out, without the need. It's almost liberating in a way too, because then we're not being forced to shift to
Yeah.
what everybody else is expecting to us, which all of us folks with trauma and people pleasing tendencies are so good at and are just hungry to do all of the time.
Yes. That preparedness piece, I think, is one of the pieces I want to talk about, because when we're, like you said, when we're in person with our students, like you can walk in a room and just be like, all right, what do you guys want? Like, and you'll see people's bodies and you can see the tension and you can see okay, I can tell everybody needs to relax today, so that's what we're going to do. You don't have that advantage as a teacher when you're online. So the prepared piece is really key. I think that's something that we have to push even further. If you're online, you've got to know what you're going to say. You have to have an agenda. You have to have a point of view, because you aren't getting that real-time feedback the way that you would in person. Again, it's just a skill set shift. But honestly, that skill set is the skill set that makes it easier to sell corporate trainings, higher education trainings. Like if you can go online, you can go online to corporations and do that if you're willing to cultivate the skill. It also is a skill that means we're vastly more employable to anybody anywhere in the world if you can get on Zoom and teach well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love what you said too about being able to then offer to all of these different spaces and audiences, because it's also the idea that yoga teachers have to get really good at translation,
Yeah.
of all the different kinds.
Yes.
Whether we're speaking to a very traditional space and we're speaking in terms of yoga and gunas and Ayurvedic language and all of that, or we are in a very secular corporate space and we have to use more science words or find a different way to meet people
Yes.
that are of a general population. It's still that work and skill of language and finding ways to translate in a way that's authentic to us and still gets the practice across to the folks that we're trying to serve.
Okay, so I want to shift just slightly. So your original 200 was in person. You did a 300-hour online, and you're doing your yoga therapy training also online. So I want to talk a little bit about this synchronous versus asynchronous learning. So the videos that people watch at any time of day versus you sitting in that Zoom room with your cohort of people where you're able to, have a back chat with somebody or like break out into breakout rooms. How much of that went on in like your 300 in yoga therapy? Were there both asynchronous and synchronous learning? Was it primarily one or the other? Go.
Yeah, this is a really good question because I think this is like the other dimension of, well, like how effective are online trainings?
Yes.
Because I think that there is a very different experience from a training that is completely asynchronous, where you watch all of the videos at your own time, and that is the full curriculum, it's pre-recorded, versus being able to have that experience where you have a mix of asynchronous and a mix of synchronous learning where everybody's there in the Zoom space. So to answer your question, both of mine and all of mine so far have been a lot of the hybrid of both of those. So some asynchronous learning, some pre-recorded things, and then study materials at home, and then live things where we come into the space for lectures, and then we come into the space separately for like group experiences. So that in itself, I think, is really skillful because I think that, or including the synchronous and the time for group meetings, I think is really skillful because for me personally, I'm one of the people that likes to like purchase courses, tries to get a third of the way through it, and then I'm like on to the next thing and forget about it, and it's sitting there and I haven't done it. So I can't imagine that if I hadn't had something that I needed to like show up for, kind of be in the room. Also, like the relationships also encourage deeper investment
Yeah.
in what's happening. Um, and we wouldn't get to learn, we wouldn't get to hear all the wisdom from all of the people in our cohorts if we didn't have those. So while I love being tucked away and studying and coming to my own conclusions for hours and days at a time, I think for the trainings, it was really special for me to be able to have the mix of synchronous uh, and asynchronous. And I really do hesitate, though, to say that there couldn't be a teacher that went through a 200-hour training, completely asynchronous, completely pre-recorded, and to tell them that they then aren't legitimate or that their training wasn't effective. It depends on how the teacher came out of it. What if they had years of all these other kinds of facilitation experience and then had been
Yes.
reading yoga for 10 years and then finally did that training? Yeah, they're probably still going to be pretty good. So I think that that's just completely dependent on person to person. I just don't think that it's appropriate to kind of label anything as better or not. And it's also very much about learning styles and how people feel situated and what makes people feel competent after a training.
Yeah, because there are plenty of people who've done all the quote unquote right steps and walked out of a training and still not felt competent. Like,
Yeah.
I mean, I know there are people out there listening who are groaning having had that experience. Like, so many people are just like, but I don't know if I can teach. I've done all the stuff. My yoga teacher trainer said I could teach, but I just don't know. I don't feel like I can. And it's interesting that you say that because you're right. One isn't necessarily better than the other. I'm going to try on an idea and see,
Yeah.
you're going to tell me how you feel about it. So let's say we have that teacher who had a completely 100% asynchronous experience, but they had been reading and studying for several years, had taken classes, gone through the whole thing. And would you feel like what would be missing is that it would be difficult for that teacher to slide from virtual experience into an in-person class in the same way that it is difficult for people who've had only in-person training to slide into a virtual class? Maybe it's just that the skill sets don't match, so we need to have specific training in both, you know?
Yeah. I think it would either way, it would be an experience and a practice in cultivating a new skill. So it
Yeah.
might be harder. It might be harder to move in because there wasn't any. If you were just, yeah, if I was just watching videos for that whole period of time, and then all of a sudden there was a room in front of me, and I hadn't practiced using my words, or practiced
Yes.
speaking, or practiced talking about yoga in front of a room, that might be pretty jarring for a while because then you start to realize like, oh, I haven't. None of this is practiced in my language. None of these neural pathways are kind of flowing in how I speak. So I feel like that would be hard. But what came to mind too is when you asked that question is actually the difference between having access to a teacher that can help us sort through confusion when we're learning yoga. Because I
Ooh,
think that the
more.
person, the teacher aspect is really important. So that's what I think what would break my heart the most if I had done through that type of experience. Um, Again, not saying that it's bad or worse, but that I wouldn't have had a teacher to then be like, wait, this doesn't make any sense to me. Wait, yoga doesn't make any sense in the Western context. What are we doing here? Like, what does this mean? Like, so the without somebody to then, which is why the teacher-student relationship is so important in the yoga
Yeah.
tradition, is that somebody's been through the path and is able to help you sort through the inevitable contradictions and confusions and all of the messiness of the vastness of the yoga space. And so, but what if we found a really good teacher in our community that could then help us do that, even if that wasn't where we did the training from? What if we still sought out other teachers and and found other ways to do that? I think that can happen, but it is, I think, really helpful to have time with the teacher that put together the curriculum that you're learning from because they brought with it a whole perspective, a whole understanding, and a whole idea and an intention of what they wanted to deliver in the training as well. So,
Okay, so well, let's talk about so Yoga Alliance. Just hey, Yoga Alliance, how you doing today? You look pretty. I like your outfit. You're doing great. We're just talking about you. So they put out these new training guidelines about how much of the training for a 200-hour yoga teacher is synchronous versus asynchronous. And it was something like 15% of the training had to be synchronous. Do you feel like that aligned with the training you had, that it was only about 15% synchronous? Was it way more synchronous? Like, was it 50-50 where you're watching 50% videos and 50% you were in those like live Zoom cohorts? Do you think 15% is enough? Because those 20-year teachers out there are like, no! Like, that seems like a very little period of time for a lot of us, but I would love your thoughts because none of us trained online. So, what do we know?
yeah. So, did you say 15% was required to be synchronous? Only 15%?
Correct, is what I'm saying.
My gut is saying that's not enough, honestly. My gut would be saying more synchronous from
Yeah.
my personal opinion and my initial like gut check would be like 15%. I'd want a lot more time. I'd want a lot more time in person. My trainings had way more than 15% uh, synchronous.
Live learning.
There
Okay.
was a very small percentage of it that was synchronous, and it was mostly about explaining topics that we were then going to be going into, like getting the lay of the land
Yeah.
was the synchronous part, or was the asynchronous part, excuse me,
Yeah.
and then the synchronous joining together was like the actual Dharma talks, lectures, lessons,
Yeah.
digging into material with cohort mates and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, I think that, yeah, that's interesting.
And for those of you listening who aren't familiar with those terms, synchronous and asynchronous learning, we're borrowing from higher education systems here, right? So, asynchronous learning would be what we would call video on demand. It's those videos that you can click on and watch at any time of the day or night and learn a topic on. Synchronous learning, that would be our live learning. That's these Zoom cohorts, the things where you're joining live, the teacher is live, and everything is happening in real time with your teacher. So if you're wondering what terminology we're using there, asynchronous learning, pre-recorded content, synchronous learning, live learning.
Yeah.
Yes. 15% does not seem like a lot.
It does not seem like a lot. I would say that there can be a lot, knowing, I'll speak from my personal experience. If I had a training where most of it was pre-recorded, I have a tendency to get distracted, right? So I think that there is less chance that I would engage fully with the material. And we can't say with going through online trainings, there isn't also some temptation to just kind of skip and say that you did something because you want the certification at the end. I've seen that desire in myself that I want to just hurry up through this and have to slow myself down to be like, but do you want to learn or do you want
Yeah.
a piece of paper? Like, do you want the piece of paper or do you want to actually absorb and be able to either in person or online transmit what you've learned? So that had to be the really important question for me, but I don't think that somebody probably could still have a really good experience if they were really dedicated, really wanted to show up. But I would say that it would be lacking if it was only 15% um, in
I, I
person.
do I do think there is something to both live in-person training and online training that is universal, and that is you will get out of it what you put into it.
Yeah.
So if you are somebody who is dedicated to studying, you are dedicated to learning material, you are reading all the things that your learning is telling you, your teacher is telling you to read, like you will just by inherent nature of effort and energy exchange be getting more out of something, whether it is online or in person. I mean, that's true in both venues, right? Like there is always going to be somebody in an in-person training who does less work than the other people.
Yes. Yeah. That's
Always.
really always. But I think that like an area that you and I love to talk about a lot too is like with the whole conversation, stop trying to pedestalize yourself over another person who had a different experience.
Yeah.
Like everybody comes to the in the same in a different everybody comes to it in a different way. So, you know, also being able then if you see that there might be something lacking, then maybe one of us can offer something that might fill in gaps for people that had a training that was missing something that might need to supplement. So then that's where we have continuing education, and that's where all of us offer all of these different things to each other. But I just really in all of the yoga and all of our spaces that we exist in, like just the lessening of the trying to the one-upmanship is not necessary.
No,
Um, it's not necessary.
no, you're great. You're doing great. And so is your neighbor. They're doing great too. So let's talk continuing education. Okay, so you've taken, you're now in yoga therapy training, and that is also a virtual experience. And I know one of the things that is a piece of any yoga therapy program is mentorship. And we've sort of tiptoed around this topic a little bit in this conversation, but I see that as something that is truly lacking industry wide, is that those of us who have been here are also not mentoring new people. Um, so I'm curious your thoughts on your experience with mentorship, how you feel like we could be offering that more industry wide, because while I didn't prep you for this question, I feel like you have thoughts. I know you have thoughts.
Oh, yeah, you know I have thoughts. Thoughts, feelings. I think so. I think the interesting part about the 200-hour model, the interesting part, right? The part I'm going to talk about right now is that we go through the process and then we don't really have somebody available to us. Maybe you can text the person, maybe you have a relationship with the teacher that you
Yep.
trained with and they are willing to do that. But like you said, it is not like a mentorship process. So then a lot of us are kind of out here like looking around for all of these different teachers, and then we see one teacher for a thing, and then we see another teacher for a thing, and then we see another teacher for a thing, and a lot of us are kind of in this like floating area of like, I really feel like I need a teacher, I really want somebody to learn from and study with, but I have no idea where to go, what's the right person, what's the best person. And there might be an element of kind of like waiting for that person to come along when the time is right, but also the actual I think the idea that students go into a 200-hour teacher training not knowing that you will need a mentor after your 200-hour to then continue to help you along the path, because the 200-hour is just the beginning and you're kind of jumping off into this whole world of all of this wild stuff that's going to happen and going to be very, very confusing. And we're not prepared for that. We're not prepared for that end of it and that side of it at all. So going through like yoga therapy and like Ayurveda training is different because there is practicum and mentorship built into the program. So then I've been able to actually sit in front of people one-on-one, do work with folks, and then get feedback. So what that looks, so then like how do we like implement that more? Are there people that are just out there kind of not leading trainings necessarily, or maybe they are, but then also are more specifically offering like post 200-hour mentorship for teachers that are like fresh, new, really trying to get going? And what kind of like specific designation might be required for that, right? Is kind of the question in terms of like building it
Yeah.
into the the industry and like building it into our like training processes. I think just first the acknowledgement that I want people to go into their training knowing that they're going to absolutely need that. Because then it starts to feel like a failure too. If after your 200 hour you have the certificate, you're supposed to be able to do all the things and you feel completely helpless and completely like deficient because you're starting, because it's just your starting point, but you don't know that it's just your starting point.
Yeah, I do sometimes feel like we train in a way that like we're having people stand on the side of the pool and you spend 200 hours on the side of the pool learning how to swim. And then at the end of the 200 hours, somebody just pushes you in.
Yeah.
Good luck.
Yeah.
You've learned everything you need. Push. Like, I mean, maybe you taught that community class at a studio, or maybe you taught a few other classes during your 200 hours. Sure, there's some 200-hour teacher training programs where there's required like teaching time,
Yeah.
but it's like so little. That amount of time is so little because 200 hours is so little anyway. You
Yeah.
don't have time to do a lot of practice teaching. Like what if it was 200 hours of learning and then 50 hours of practice teaching and then you go? What
Yeah.
a different experience people would be having. Because I don't even necessarily think you need more learning time in 200 hours at the beginning. You need more practice teaching time. Like, would you have signed up for a program that was like that if you were training to be a 200-hour teacher? And I know you had a really wonderful experience with your 200-hour. Like,
I did, luckily. That's really, yeah, I will say that. I had a really lovely 200-hour training, which is
yes.
not the exclusive experience. Yeah.
Would you have been excited to have 50 hours of practice time before you went out teaching? Do you feel like that would have made you feel more comfortable in it?
As a person that usually sits in the front of the classroom, I would have really
Who
enjoyed
me?
that. Yeah, exactly. I would have really enjoyed that because after I would have wanted to go through and then talk about all of the things that were going on in my head during the class and really get to have that exchange with the
Yeah.
teacher in the same way that I've always been like really eager but afraid for that feedback on a paper, but really want it because ultimately I do want to improve, right?
Yep.
And
Yep.
so in the same way with teaching, that would have helped me a lot. And also you could even think of it in terms of like my experience like in restaurants, like training people in restaurants. There wasn't ever a point in time I would go through the process with people that I was training and whatever process we were doing on at work. You don't, hopefully this does happen, but you're not just throwing people that have never worked a register or talked to people in a customer service setting into the busiest time right away. Usually there would be some training before that. So it's the whole, yeah, being thrown into the pool without actually having any practice swimming with the floaties at all.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the
I think
mentorship I think would be great, and I think that if that was built in a more conscious way, I think that would do uh, students and new teachers a great deal of good.
I agree. Like, and this is one of the things that has been in my brain about pieces of the process of being a student and then shifting into a teacher that I feel like is missing. So, as you know, in the studio, we have a studentship program, which I feel like is one of the pieces that is missing. The only option to learn more after a 1 hour yoga class is to do a 200-hour teacher training. And so,
Quite
I
extreme. Yeah.
I know, I know, which is like such a bizarre, like, how's this the conclusion we've reached? But like, so, we have like this 30-hour studentship thing that happens where you can kind of dip your toe in and see if it's something interesting. And then it would be interesting to have another like 50-hour mentorship thing on the other end of a 200-hour teacher training program, like designed for new yoga teachers. Like, then what happens? Like, the you've got your certificate, somebody has taught you where your scapula is and what the trikonasana is supposed to look like, Now what? Before you get out there, what is your, this is the question I hear most often because I typically am not training 200-hour teachers. People graduate from 200-hour teacher training programs and then they come and find me at my studio and go, I don't know how to make this a job.
Yeah.
Like, that's the question everybody asks is, how is this your job? I feel like you asked me that question. Like,
I think I've asked you that question maybe once a month the entire time that I've known you. How is this your job? How is this my job? And then it's like, oh, and I guess for me though, like that's when yoga therapy made a lot more sense.
yeah,
Knowing
yes,
knowing what I wanted to do. But again, that's not everybody's inclination.
right. What if you do want to just teach group classes? I mean,
Yeah.
I had this conversation literally last week with a new teacher at the studio, and he came to me and he was like, so how is this your job? Like, how is this what you're doing? I am a newly trained teacher and I have all these other interests, this particular person has interests in, the therapeutic application, but also in physicality, because training physically, like, how do I make that intersection happen? And I was like, and as he and I were talking, I was like, oh, there really isn't anybody sitting down to tell people what potential job prospects there are in this industry either. Like, as he's talking about how these things intersect, and I was like, the Cubs, the baseball team, for those who are the Chicago Cubs, for those of you who are not US based or Midwest based, the Cubs have a mindfulness trainer on their team, and this person is teaching them yoga asana, but also meditation and how to keep your head in the game. Like, that's also a job. Did you know that? Like,
Yeah. The a while back, embodiedphilosophy.com did a like future of the yoga teacher summit, and somebody that I believe that you're familiar with that has the yoga talent agency.
oh yeah, Ava.
Yes, she had said something about yoga teachers needing to know that if they want to shift over and build something full time as a yoga teacher, you can expect a 5 to 7 year lead time.
Yes.
That's how long it takes to build. Nobody has that in mind at the end of a 200 hour. We are not taught that or heard that number at all. I remember sitting there like, well, wow, if I had had that perspective of it could take that long to build what I'm doing, I would have had the pressure would have been not there nearly as much
Yes.
to then be somewhere else. Or there was multiple times where it's like, oh, I'm going to do this full time because I really want to. And then the whole thing of like, well, wait, how does anybody do this full time? I had no idea that you really had to have a slow buildup. Potentially, some people might get there very quickly, of course, but
Sure.
not expecting to get there very quickly, expecting to have that thing that you're doing full time or part time still while that's getting you all the way there. And also that you can still be valid if you don't want to do it full time. It doesn't have to be what
Right.
you do full time either. Like that doesn't have to be the end goal. But I just remember hearing that like, wow, if I would have had the perspective of like, oh, this is like quite a much longer journey that you're taking, but without having any time frame or any idea of how long it could take, it's like, am I just staring into infinity, never like just running in place the whole time? Is that what this is going to be like? Because that's
Yes.
pretty miserable.
Well,
And
especially now, because when a lot of times I think the advice given to new yoga teachers is from people who came up in a different time in our industry. Like, when I came up,
yeah,
there were 17 classes a week that I could pick up, and I did. And I taught, I was teaching, I mean, this is like one of those, this story, but one of those
yes.
famous stories of like, I was pregnant with my daughter teaching 18 classes a week and met a class with a sign to tell them I couldn't teach after my water broke, kind of like insanity. But that is what it was at that time.
Yeah.
And now that's not my experience anymore, and I'm using weekly group classes for an entirely different purpose in my career than I was 10 years ago, of course. But that's also how I'm able to go into a Fortune 100 company and make $1,000 in 3 hours. Like, that's just like a skill set shift based on the fact that I taught a hell of a lot of classes, and those classes don't exist anymore. There aren't likely 18 classes a week for most of you.
No, no, there is not. And you also have to, I think it was maybe a little bit different at the time too, where like in order to do that in a place like Iowa City, just thinking about population size, I'd also have to be looped up with all of these different yoga studios that all have a different culture and serve a different group of people and have different employment processes and different payment processes. And then handling and juggling that alone would be, you know, it would be ridiculous.
Oh,
For me
absolutely.
anyway, I have no interest in doing that. Yeah.
A lot of times you hear of people nowadays who are teaching 15, 16, 18 yoga classes a week. They own a yoga studio and they are the only teacher there. Like potentially I could do that at Sunlight, right? Like I could say, okay, I am teaching all, I think we're up to 19 classes a week. I don't want to do that. But that could be how I make my living. I mean, that is potential, but also we have more potential to make livings in different ways now than we ever had. There was also nothing else I could have done 10 years ago. There were
Sure.
no, there were no research studies. There was yoga therapy wasn't a thing then. You were just teaching as many classes as possible. Okay, so let me ask you this as one final question. What do you see for the future of yoga as an industry? What would you like to see happen as somebody who has been teaching since 2017, 2018 is when you trained, right? So you're in like the early mid phase of your career here. Where would you like to see us go? Because I think a lot of us who are been in here 15, 20 years, we have opinions, but also no idea of what could actually be the future. So what do you see? What do you want to see?
This is a really good question that I know will require deeper thought than the response I'm going to give right now. But I think what I want to see is a different orientation in how we train. I think that I would really like to see, um, as you know, as people that are listening might not know, though, a lot of my training is in the realm of community organizing and social justice. So I have access and equity on my mind all of the time when I'm thinking about trainings, but also like deep reverence for the tradition that we practice that I don't think the 200-hour model that we currently use really, really honors. I think that there is a lot that is missing. And the way forward, I think for me would be a different structure. Like some people literally think a yoga teacher training should be like a 4-year degree before we can
Right.
go ahead and do that, before we can go ahead and teach. I think that there's more that is needed, but I also really care about access, and I don't think that yoga absolutely has to be an academic pursuit either.
Yeah.
Um, so there's a lot of nuance, but I think if I'm going to boil it down to something that like what I want to see in the future, I think that I would like to see a broader transparency within the trainings right off the bat about what the yoga world actually looks like, and the fact that it is in deep flux, especially right now, and that it's going to continue to look different. That there has to be a balance between um, keeping people safe and having structures and guidelines and everything that we have from like the parameters around trainings, while also like respecting the tradition and the fact that people come to yoga in very different ways. And the last thing that's really on my mind is just kind of about how we might shift the structure away from this 200-hour, 300-hour, 500-hour that doesn't always mean the same thing. I think the inconsistencies within training is something like to dig into. And I can see right now that I don't have as solid of answers for that question. Like, what do I want for the future is still something I need to form opinions around and ideas around about what I would really like to be different in this space. I think that the last thing I'll say is that I really do like the mentorship part that you brought up.
Yeah.
I think that we do have the opportunity to help teachers be more competent, confident, and secure in what they're doing, which then also lends itself out to teachers being more skilled in holding equitable space and being aware of where those inequities exist, and then also being able to keep people safer because they have more skills and more understanding of yoga as well.
Coming in 2024 from Sunlight Yoga and Apothecary, Zaria and Rebecca's mentorship program.
That sounds like a good project.
Okay, thank you so much for coming on the podcast and talking about this. We have been talking about you coming on the podcast for so long, and this I knew was going to be the perfect subject for you to talk about. So thank you so much. Tell everybody where to find you.
Yeah, it was lovely being here. I am on Instagram at Zaria Yoga. You can find my website that has all of my offerings. I work with people one-on-one. I also do sound healing work, and I love writing about yoga and all of my musings about the world as it is. That's introspectionyoga.com. I do teach at Sunlight Yoga and Apothecary in Davenport, Iowa, a pretty cool space. And local folks in Iowa City, you can also catch me teaching weekly yoga classes at Public Space One. It is an artist collective here that a group of us have yoga offerings that we do every week. Instagram is probably the best place to find me for yoga talking things.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Zaria, for being on the podcast. Here are our key takeaways. We are often really snobby about the value of online learning versus in-person learning. We tend to make people who learn online feel like they are less than those who trained in person. And I don't know if I agree with that. Online learning makes our industry entry point much more accessible, and this is one of the huge benefits that we see to online learning in general. Now, it is uncomfortable to learn the skills to teach well in an online setting. Especially for those of us who never thought we would be teaching online, it is easy to say that online is not as good as in-person learning. But really, what we're saying is that we need to sit with the discomfort of learning a new skill set in order to share our teaching with more people. Online teaching requires us to be more prepared than we need to be in person. This means that the quote-unquote read the room technique of teaching that many of us use, myself included here, doesn't apply in an online setting. Synchronous versus asynchronous learning matters. Typically, we need to have some sort of synchronous learning in order to assure that quality teachers are coming out of training programs. But the Yoga Alliance requires very little of this. If you think that should change, make sure you tell them by reaching out at help.yogaalliance.org. Having a teacher who can guide us as we sort through yoga is critically important, be that teacher online or in person. If you don't have that kind of relationship with someone, it would behoove you to actively seek it out. The current training model within our industry is a lot like learning to swim on the side of a pool. Make sure that you lean into mentorship after your training so that can make a big difference in your first couple years of yoga teaching. And finally, an important quote Zaria repeated from Ava Taylor. It may take up to 7 years to really get a handle on building a career as a yoga professional. Be prepared. The more we repeat this, the more we have realistic expectations for our entire industry. Now, next week, I'm sharing a conversation with Joanne Spence, the woman who literally wrote the book on trauma-informed yoga. You won't want to miss it. Thanks for listening, friends. I will catch you around the water cooler next time.